Hi, this is April. Today I wanted to show you a video from Candice Owens, who did a recent podcast on the Tucker Carlson interview with Russian President Putin. Candice identified 5 takeaways from this interview that we should understand. The interview is over 2 hours in length, so parts of it aren't relevant and don't necessarily contribute anything. However, he provides us with a good amount of history regarding the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. I think we all wonder what Putin hopes to gain out of this war and why he went into it in the first place. Tucker spent most of his time in this interview asking questions, and Putin did most of the talking. However, if we listen closely, Putin reveals more about his relationship with us and our leaders than we have heard before. Putin also discusses some of the private discussions that he has held with some of our past presidents. Candice does an excellent job at directing the interview and drawing out the key points. We have edited Candice's analysis of the interview to a little over 30 minutes, where she makes her 5 points.
We would have ever had the opportunity to have this happen had it not been for Tucker Carlson being an independent journalist sitting down with Vladimir Putin. And the implications are severe. So I'm going to take you through the 5 biggest moments and what they mean. But first, I want to start with this clip from Julian Assange.
One of the hopeful things that I've discovered is that nearly every war that has started in the past 50 years has been a result of media lies. The media could have stopped it. If they had searched deep enough, if they hadn't reprinted government propaganda, they could have stopped it. But what does that mean? Well, that means basically populations don't like wars. And populations have to be fooled into wars. Populations don't willingly and with open eyes go into a war. So if we have a good media environment, then we'll also have a peaceful environment.
How do you fool a population into war? That's what we're discussing today, coming up on Candice Owens. But between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin, and to really understand why it was that they were freaking out. When I say they, I am talking about the mainstream media pundits were freaking out. They didn't even know what Putin was going to say, but they knew that the conversation was not allowed to be had, which is weird, obviously, because if their narrative that Putin is a crazy, insane, ailing, dying dictator is accurate, then wouldn't you want more cameras on him? Wouldn't you want to say, look, we told you he's crazy and we have to go to war? So I want to back this up, because the question I asked you is, how do you fool a population into war? Well, in 1949, English writer George Orwell published a novel, you may have heard of it, entitled 1984. And he describes really a totalitarian nightmare society where there is mass surveillance, a repressive totalitarian regime, constant propaganda, the thought police, right, telling you whether something is true or something is false, a ministry of truth that gets to establish whether or not what you are saying is true or false. This is why when you see people talking about an Orwellian nightmare online, when they're saying, oh my God, I wrote something about a vaccine, and then suddenly a fact checker came in, people go, oh, that is the ministry of truth. And in the West, unbeknownst to most of us, because we've been brainwashed, we have been living inside of an Orwellian nightmare. This is a direct quotation, by the way, from 1984 regarding how one aspect of this alleged society would be, this dystopian society rather, would be that there could be no concept of history. You're not allowed to learn history in a society like this. And this is the quotation. Every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book rewritten. Every picture has been repainted. Every statue and street building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. And the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. Yes. Thinking about American society, thinking about people pulling down statues, rewriting history, telling us everybody was a racist, a sexist, a misogynist. This is why these books can no longer exist. We are living in a permanent present, which is why Americans know nothing about history. That is the biggest takeaway, the first takeaway, I would say, rather, from this sit-down interview is just how ignorant Americans are about not even history a long time ago, but history even a couple of years ago. And it's intentional, by the way. Look at these recent statistics coming out of Washington, D.C. What these statistics reveal is that in the Washington, D.C. area, by the way, this is supposed to be the wealthiest areas surrounding Washington, D.C., just 19% of students are proficient in math, and just 31% are proficient in English. That is an utter insanity, but it is intentional. This is why the federal government wanted to install the Department of Education, because it was meant to be a department of propaganda and a department that is going to convince children of a permanent present, care about this present issue, don't actually even know how to speak your own language or be able to calculate anything into the future, but we're going to convince you that this is an education anyway. It's an abject failure. So when Putin sat down with Tucker, the first hour really was just him focused in describing the history of the Russian Empire. I mean, he started in 8th century. It was stunning. Take a listen.
The Russian state started gathering itself as a centralized statehood, and it is considered to be the year of the establishment of the Russian state in 862. In 1862, Russia celebrated the 1000th anniversary of its statehood. The next very significant date in the history of Russia was 988. This was the baptism of Russia. Back in the Middle Ages, Prince Yaroslav the Wise introduced the order of succession to a throne.
So yes, that was quite stunning, and people were going, I couldn't pay attention to him going through that, because in America, they want you to be ADHD. They don't even want you to be able to focus on hearing anything long form. And in America, as I said, we are definitely not allowed to learn history, not our history, least of all the history of the Russian Empire. In fact, you don't even likely know what happened in 2014. That was something that became apparent to me as I was trying to discuss Ukraine as a region, talking about what their relationship was to Russia, and I was attacked by the media. So let me tell you what happened in 2014. Ukraine at that time had a pro-Russian, democratically elected President Viktor Yanukovych. The U.S. then openly supported a coup against him. And they did this by supporting, you're not even going to believe this, far-right neo-Nazis. Remember the Azov battalion that you may have seen the media trying to get you not to pay attention to? Yes, throughout this interview, Putin keeps talking about trying to denazify Ukraine. He's not being dramatic. There are neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and yes, they are wearing emblems of swastikas and things of that nature to recruit people, talking about the supremacy of the Aryan race. And before 2021, our media told us how bad this neo-Nazi problem was in Ukraine. Take a listen to this Time correspondent who traveled to Ukraine in the summer of 2019 to investigate their white supremacy problem.
Over the last few years, experts in violent extremism have grown especially alarmed about the Azov movement. The group emerged from the revolution that swept across Ukraine in 2014, and it has gotten a lot stronger amid the ongoing war with pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine.
The official symbol of Azov, it's a version of Wolfsangel. It was one of the symbols of one of SS division during the World War II. It is one of more or less usual symbols for neo-Nazi groups all over the world.
What worries officials in the West is Azov's recruitment strategy. It's tried hard to build friendships with far-right groups around the world, especially in the US and Europe. During my visit in 2019, I spent a day at one of the biggest recruitment events in Azov's history. Thousands of people showed up for a day of fighting sports and blatant propaganda. There were neo-Nazi symbols, tattoos, and posters all over the place.
So just to recap, despite all of this information that we knew about this far-right group, despite the fact that we knew that they were Nazis, your media decided to abandon that narrative because, well, we had staged a coup by locking arms with these neo-Nazis. And so when 2021 happened and Putin started saying this Nazi problem, why is the West funding it? We just went ahead and did an about-face. Incredulously, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, allegedly, right? Get its roots because they're constantly calling people anti-Semitic, right? They constantly talk about the Holocaust. They got behind the Azov battalion. They said, we don't consider them a far-right group anymore people that are wearing Nazi symbols. We don't consider them a far-right group anymore. We consider them freedom fighters. What does that tell you about the ADL? That they are a part of a propagandist arm, that they work for the state, and at their core, they are Marxists. They don't believe any of the things that they say. They just want to censor speech and control speech. These are all fraudulent groups. So yes, going back to this narrative so that you understand, we then installed a puppet regime, Poroshenko, on Russia's borders. And what happened was it prompted a civil war in Ukraine. Now, pay attention to the fact that this happened back in 2014. Why is that significant? Because I think that we would have gone to war in Ukraine much earlier had it not been for a certain Donald J. Trump, who was unexpected by the state. They typically are picking our presidents. They did not expect Donald Trump, and the regime flipped out because it was an interruption into perfectly laid plans that they had begun in 2014. So what happened, yes, was that Ukraine launched basically a civil war is what happened. People in the East versus people in the West, right? People that were in the East, obviously backed by Russia, going, what is going on? And people in the West, backed by the Ukraine army, backed by the United States, because, well, the west of Ukraine, I know that a lot of Ukrainians watch this show, has had influence by NATO. They have been influenced. They have been making incursions, all sorts of little things that are happening. In fact, I was talking about this when the war broke out. I was trying to draw people to the fact that what is happening is really sort of a civil dispute that has been going on for a very long time, that the majority of people that lived in Ukraine spoke Russian until they started mandating that they no longer teach Russian in the schools. This is kind of trying to change the culture. And when I talked about these facts right at the outbreak of the war in 2021, the media came for me, because you're not allowed to talk about history, you're not allowed to talk about facts. And the narrative at that time was just that, oh, Putin's trying to rebuild the Soviet Union. Nothing happened in 2014. These are actually headlines that are written about me. Behold the face of pure ignorance. Candice Owens mocked by Pulitzer-winning historian for Ukraine comment. Another headline, Candice Owens backs Putin's claim that Russia created Ukraine. No, I wasn't backing Putin. I was just obviously talking about the truth, that this was all a part of the Russian Empire, that obviously people were majority speaking Russian, that this dispute that is going on is something that we should put into a historical context, which is what Putin did in the interview last night. So to be clear, to acknowledge history, to talk about the language that is spoken, to talk about programs that is trying to change the main language that is spoken, does not make you a Putin puppet. That just means that you're acknowledging history, which is something that the West now wants to condemn. Let's get to point number 2 that should have been taken away from this interview. And it's something that I have been talking about extensively on this show. And that is that the CIA controls politicians all throughout the West, and they intentionally start wars. Let's listen to Julian Assange again in a prior clip discussing just this fact.
Because the goal is not to completely subjugate Afghanistan. The goal is to use Afghanistan to wash money out of the tax bases of the United States, out of the tax bases of European countries, through Afghanistan and back into the hands of a transnational security elite. That is the goal, i.e. the goal is to have an endless war, not a successful war. So Stop the War Coalition is important because we have to prevent it becoming normal for there to be a constant war.
Endless wars, constant wars. So you can imagine why the CIA quite literally tried to kill Julian Assange and wanted to prevent the information that he had found about these wars, what we've been doing overseas. He released documents pertaining to us just killing Iraqi civilians like it was a sport. No. We're not supposed to know what goes on overseas. We're supposed to believe that we're always fighting for freedom. We're spreading democracy when we're shooting civilians in the Middle East. And we're spreading democracy when we are having military members guard the poppy fields, which we know obviously creates opium. And now we have an opioid crisis, but let's not get into that. What is the CIA up to? Well, Putin, in his interview, made it very clear that the president is just a puppet that has no real power. And the CIA controls the president. In essence, that would mean that our entire republic, the concept of democracy, is an illusion, right? That there is an elite that is controlling. And he exemplified this by going over all the presidents who he had had conversations with, president to president, and then suddenly the CIA would swoop in and tell him, no, that's not what we're doing, don't listen to a word. But he says, take a listen to this.
So twice you've described U.S. presidents making decisions and then being undercut by their agency heads. So it sounds like you're describing a system that's not run by the people who are elected in your telling.
Именно так.
That's right. That's right. In the end, they just told us to get lost. I'm not going to tell you the details because I think it's incorrect. After all, it was confidential conversation. But our proposal was declined. That's a fact.
So who is operating the CIA and what are their interests? Because clearly the interests are not the American people, and clearly the interests are not people all across the West. And yet they have remarkable control, not just over politicians in America, but all throughout Europe. Any country that is in the European Union presumably is being controlled by the CIA, is being controlled rather by intelligence agencies, maybe by a different name, but they're all one. I think that's become abundantly clear by now. And here's another question. Why don't Americans care? What do we care about instead? Oh, I know. Climate change, right? We don't learn about history. We don't learn about present, but they instead want you to act like emotional animals about various topics like racism and sexism, and definitely climate change, which makes this next portion of the interview, the number 3 takeaway, incredibly crucial. In case you missed it, and you likely did because our media didn't want you to pay attention to it, but our CIA blew up a pipeline in the Baltic Sea. Now, what are we talking about now? In order for you to have energy, in order for you to turn on the lights, there are pipelines that are coming from Russia into Europe, right? So the CIA blew up one of these pipelines. So you know how we're talking about an energy crisis. Energy prices are so expensive. Okay, so wouldn't that have automatically been an act of war to blow up an energy pipeline? If there's national sovereignty, actually in Europe, if there's national sovereignty in Germany and the CIA blows up a pipeline, wouldn't they declare war? Wouldn't they say, oh my gosh, how did you do this? Unless they knew that it was going to happen. And also, isn't Germany and the EU so obsessed with carbon and climate and environmental disasters as they tax you into oblivion? Why didn't they go, oh my gosh, well, that seems a bit crazy that they blew up this pipeline in the middle of a sea? No, none of that happened. And it's interesting to hear this exchange between Putin and Tucker discussing this pipeline, the Nord Stream pipeline being blown up. Take a listen.
Who blew up Nord Stream?
You for sure.
I was busy that day. Nate, do you have I did not blow up Nord Stream. Thank you, though.
У вас лично, может быть, есть алиби, у вас лично.
You personally may have an alibi, but the CIA has no such alibi.
Do you have evidence that NATO or the CIA did it?
Знаете,
You know, I won't get into details, but people always say in such cases, look for someone who is interested. But in this case, we should not only look for someone who is interested, but also for someone who has capabilities. Because there may be many people interested, but not all of them are capable of sinking to the bottom of the Baltic Sea and carrying out this explosion. These two components should be connected. Who is interested and who is capable of doing it?
As I said, this is not Russian propaganda that we're showing you. This is now accepted by virtually every foreign policy analyst, and that we did this. We blew up the pipeline, which again makes you wonder why Germany would not have responded to this. Take a listen to Putin expanding on that implausibility.
But here's a question you may be able to answer. You worked in Germany, famously. The Germans clearly know that their NATO partner did this, and it damaged their economy greatly. It may never recover. Why are they being silent about it? That's very confusing to me. Why wouldn't the Germans say something about it?
Меня это тоже удивляет.
This also confuses me. But today's German leadership is guided by the interests of the collective West rather than its national interests. Otherwise, it is difficult to explain the logic of their action or inaction. After all, It is not only about Nord Stream 1, which was blown up, and the Nord Stream 2 was damaged. But one pipe is safe and sound, and gas can be supplied to Europe through it. But Germany does not open it. We're ready, please. There's another route through Poland, called Yamal Europe, which also allows for large flow. Poland has closed it, but Poland packs from the German hand. It receives money from the pan-European funds, and Germany is the main donor to these pan-European funds. Germany feeds Poland to a certain extent, and they close their route to Germany. Why? I don't understand.
So in school, children are learning about climate change. They don't even understand how energy works. They don't understand what pipelines are running throughout the world. They don't understand why it is a nonsense for any nation not to aspire to be energy independent. And yet their nations are doing the exact opposite. Why would any nation want to be energy dependent on somebody else? What it seems to me is that what's happening in the West is an artificial creation of an energy crisis, right? Why are they doing that? Why are they pretending that there is a crisis when they could very easily bring down the costs that we are seeing? Well, maybe it's because despite the narrative that we have been told that the West is always fighting for peace and democracy, we are actually causing wars and conflicts all across the world. It is time for us to wake up. It is time for us to take the baton that brave journalists like Julian Assange, whose entire life has been taken from him, essentially, and journalists like Tucker Carlson are trying to hand to us. We need to stop believing in the propaganda that surrounds us and start looking into history and looking for actual coverage of issues that are happening on a foreign policy perspective. Go back and revisit WikiLeaks. You will really quickly determine what I said long ago. It is an absolute nonsense to suggest that Vladimir Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Union. In fact, the exact opposite is happening. If the Soviet Union is being recreated, it is the European Union, right? They are the ones that keep inching and expanding and putting their military on people's borders, not Vladimir Putin and Russia, who has a GDP that's smaller than California. But again, they don't teach economics in school. They don't want you to understand why it's utterly irrational, quite literally from a financial and economic perspective, to suggest that Vladimir Putin is trying to take over the world. They want you dumb, and they want you to believe in a narrative. Putin, bad. Donald Trump, bad. Racism, sexism, climate change, anti-Semitism, bad. Fight whatever it is that we point to. We are dumb, deluded, and drugged, and fat. These are the things that they're doing. They're creating slave colonies all throughout Europe and the United States. We have become slaves to our government because they have pushed through Marxist principle, and that's what Marxism is all about. You have to learn and study Karl Marx. It is who informs their opinion. Constantly keep us angry about something, the proletariat, the working class, white versus black, short versus tall, women versus men, progressive, so that we never pause and look backwards and understand who it is exactly that is ruling over us. And it certainly is not Vladimir Putin. He also, in this interview, talks about how many times he attempted to come to peaceful resolve with the West over the years. He doesn't understand why they keep refuting him. It is a fact that Vladimir Putin tried to join NATO, and he was refused. He also tells a story about Boris Johnson, and this is absolutely wild, that they were going to have peace negotiations before they slaughtered an entire generation of Ukrainian men. But Boris Johnson, then the Prime Minister of the UK, shut it down. Why? Why would Boris Johnson tell Zelensky not to entertain peace talks with Russia? Well, the obvious answer is that they are hell-bent on a war with Russia. That doesn't give us the answer to why on earth they would want that, especially because Putin, the crazy dictator, doesn't particularly sound like he wants a war. Every time Tucker asked him a question where he could have signaled his strength or sounded like an evil dictator, he sounded, I would say, remarkably calm and collected. Take a listen.
Maybe the world is breaking into two hemispheres, one with cheap energy, the other without. And I want to ask you that. If we're now a multipolar world, obviously we are, can you describe the blocks of alliances? Who is in each side, do you think?
Listen, you have said that the world is breaking into two hemispheres. A human brain is divided into two hemispheres. One is responsible for one type of activities, the other one is more about creativity and so on. But it is still one and the same head. The world should be a single whole. Security should be shared rather than meant for the golden billion. That is the only scenario where the world could be stable, sustainable, and predictable. Until then, while the head is split in two parts, it is an illness, a serious adverse condition. It is a period of severe disease that the world is going through now. But I think that, thanks to honest journalism, this work is akin to work of the doctors. This could somehow be remedied.
He's talking about bringing different sides together, saying that honest journalism will allow for it to happen. Does that sound like the evil dictator that has been dictated to you, dictated to all of us via the mainstream media? That's not what I got. He actually sounded, again, very calm, very rational, and very confused about why the CIA wants to go to war with him. This brings me to the last big takeaway from this interview. And I think this is the answer to why it is that America wants to go to war. It's because we have a lot of stupid geriatrics that have an old world disorder, right? Who are not changing strategies and who are not adapting to the new world, and honestly have put us in a very bad position. They're losing power. I think that we are on the brink of an economic collapse because obviously that was going to happen when they made the incredibly stupid decision to have Russia circumvent the dollar. We used to be, everybody had to deal in dollars all across the world. Again, this is stuff they don't teach you in school, right? All across the world, you got to deal in dollars. And then what happened? This war broke out and America decided to sanction. They started to use the dollar to be able to control foreign policy. They said, you can't deal in dollars. And they thought this was going to bring Russia to economic collapse. It did just the opposite. Russia's economy grew. They learned to circumvent the dollar, and it encouraged other countries to circumvent the dollar. And as Putin illustrates throughout this interview, what it means is that a lot of them are now dealing with China, and they are forming alliances, and it doesn't matter anymore about the big bad US. Take a listen.
Well, let's just give one example, the US dollar, which has kind of united the world in a lot of ways, maybe not to your advantage, but certainly to ours. Is that going away as the reserve currency, the universally accepted currency? How have sanctions, do you think, changed the dollar's place in the world?
You know, to use the dollar as a tool of foreign policy struggle is one of the biggest strategic mistakes made by the US political leadership. The dollar is the cornerstone of the United States power. I think everyone understands very well that no matter how many dollars are printed, they are quickly dispersed all over the world. Inflation in the United States is minimal. It's about 3 or 3.4%, which is, I think, totally acceptable for the US. But they won't stop printing. What does the debt of $33 trillion tell us about? It is about the emission. Nevertheless, it is the main weapon used by the United States to preserve its power across the world. As soon as the political leadership decided to use the US dollar as a tool of political struggle, a blow was dealt to this American power. I would not like to use any strong language, but it is a stupid thing to do and a grave mistake.
He is correct. It was a grave mistake for us to do that, to begin to use the dollar to dictate foreign policy, because inevitably other countries are going to go, why would we do this? Why would we allow you to tell us how we have to live and what we have to agree to in order to be able to be a part of the global market? It doesn't make any sense. So what happened, naturally, I would say, is that in 2006, some countries got together and said, let's challenge that sort of economic authority. And those countries were known as BRICS nations. Initially, it was Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And then later on, in 2010, South Africa joined on. And now these BRICS nations, thanks to our geniuses in the CIA, thinking that they were going to force Russia into an economic collapse, are enjoying a lot of success. Yeah, the predictions are forecasting. Their nations are up. People are now dealing with them. Take a listen to Putin describing that.
As for BRICS, where Russia took over the presidency this year, the BRICS countries are, by and large, developing very rapidly. Look, if memory serves me right, back in 1992, the share of the G7 countries in the world economy amounted to 47%, whereas in 2022 it was down to, I think, a little over 30%. The BRICS countries accounted for only 16% in 1992, but now their share is greater than that of the G7. It has nothing to do with the events in Ukraine. This is due to the trends of global development and world economy, as I mentioned just now. And this is inevitable. This will keep happening. It is like the rise of the sun. You cannot prevent the sun from rising. You have to adapt to it. How do the United States adapt? With the help of force, sanctions, pressure, bombings, and use of armed forces.
Here's what I'm going to say conclusively about what he is talking about, and it is the answer to the question of why America wants a war. Why not just America, the European nations want a war. It's because wars present economic opportunities, right? If you are a poorer country and you come out on top in war, well, you could suddenly become a very wealthy country. Things change dramatically. America was put on the map after World War I. I think what we have right now, as I said earlier, is a geriatric group of people that are running foreign policy, and they think they are going to get away with doing things the old way, right? It is really essentially just old school imperialism. We are going to plunder and we are going to steal like we are Rome, like we are the Roman Empire. And nobody's going to say anything about it. This has more or less been our foreign policy perspective, certainly since 2011. Nobody in America can tell you what we're doing overseas, but we always have to be doing something overseas. We stage revolutions, we fund rebels to go into certain countries, we force regime changes, and then we take stuff. We take stuff from other countries. That's just a fact, right? And what sort of a philosophy is this, by the way, at its core that we're seeing? Why can't America and European countries instead just make policies that make sense? Really pursue capitalism, really pursue the free market, the invention of ideas, because that is what it means to be a Marxist. There is nothing original, right? There's nothing inspiring. It doesn't inspire brilliance. So what America is suffering from is a form of cultural Marxism, right? And they are trying to tax its citizens to death. It is the death of creation. It's the death of the American spirit. It has been a death of patriotism happening in this country. We are no longer creating anymore. And so what they're going to do is to try to, and this is absolutely, utterly psychopathic in my view, is to force a world war so they can restage all of this.
I hope this video from Candice Owens was informative. She gave us 5 points to remember about this important interview. It was the first time in many years that a United States journalist had done a real interview with Putin. He was quite candid with some of his answers, and gave us a good history lesson on the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. I can't help but believe in many of his answers. And certainly, he confirmed that our leaders are not telling us the truth. Could one of the reasons that Putin went to war was because America was not willing to talk with him or would not take him seriously? Certainly, his statement on the BRICS nations is correct. Putting the sanctions on Russia and blowing up the pipeline has driven Russia and others into the BRICS camp. The war has weakened the dollar, and Biden's huge spending bill has created inflation in America. Unless we change direction, and soon, America and other Western countries will be driven into a third world status. We already see some division in the Western powers, with France looking at the idea of joining BRICS. The outcome of the 2024 election will have an immediate impact on the world as we know it. I encourage all of you to listen to our recent video on the Ukraine with Glenn Beck, as it provides some ideas as to why Biden is so supportive of this war. It accomplishes two goals of the elites. First, it hastens the downfall of America, as our debt has grown so much over the last 2 years. And when America falls, it will allow the elites to implement their plan in the Western world. To watch more videos on the cultural issues of today, go to Nehemiah Reset's website at nehemiahreset.org or on our rumble.com channel. Be sure to subscribe to our weekly newsletter where we outline our latest videos. Thanks again for watching and supporting our website. We look forward to seeing you again soon on another video.